Why were medieval knights more dangerous than modern soldiers? At first it sounds strange. Modern armies have rifles, tanks, and drones. But knights fought in a world without rules of engagement, where violence was personal, direct, and often unchecked. They trained for combat from childhood, lived by a culture that rewarded aggression, and carried weapons designed for brutal close-range encounters. Armed with heavy armor, devastating melee tools, and powerful warhorses, they weren't just warriors on the battlefield, they were mobile enforcers in everyday life. Unlike modern soldiers tied to discipline, oversight, and international law, knights had the freedom to act on impulse. That lack of restraint, combined with lifelong training and the constant use of force, made them individually far more dangerous in the world they lived in. Number 1. What more dangerous really means. When trying to compare medieval knights to modern soldiers, the first challenge is defining what dangerous actually means. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking about destructive power in terms of technology. Modern weapons can wipe out entire units with artillery, missiles, or drones, something a knight could never dream of. But if we narrow the lens to the individual level, the danger one trained fighter poses when directly confronting another human being, whether on a battlefield or during the messy in-between of raids and sieges, the picture changes. Knights existed in a social and military system that not only trained them for close combat, but also rewarded them for using it without restraint. Violence wasn't a tool of last resort. It was a primary currency of survival and advancement. Wealth came from plunder and ransom, honor from displays of strength, loyalty from the ability to protect and, if necessary, terrify. Unlike modern armies, which operate under rigid structures of command, discipline, and international oversight, medieval warfare had very few external controls. No treaties limited the scope of force, and no independent media monitored campaigns. A knight's accountability was mostly to his lord or his peers, and even then only loosely. That meant the practical ceiling on personal violence was much higher than for a modern soldier, who was constrained by training not just in tactics, but in law and ethics. Knights also operated in a world where war blurred constantly into everyday life. Campaigns often meant chevauchee-mounted raids designed to devastate farmland, villages, and trade routes. These weren't battles of mass armies colliding on open fields, but systematic acts of destruction and intimidation. Here, the knight's danger wasn't abstract. It was immediate. He and his retinue could appear at a village unannounced, take what they needed, burn what they couldn't carry, and disappear before local defenses could organize. To the people who lived in medieval Europe, a knight wasn't just a soldier. He was a moving threat whose presence often meant loss of livelihood or worse. Compare that with modern soldiers, who are generally deployed under orders to minimize civilian harm, operating within frameworks that at least in principle distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Even when those frameworks fail, the expectation of restraint exists. For knights, the expectation was often the opposite. Violence proved power, and power secured order. The tools of a knight also reinforce this personal danger. A longsword, lance, mace, or warhammer required direct physical application, and armor allowed him to close the gap without fearing immediate reprisal. Mounted on a warhorse, he could scatter untrained infantry, or ride down fleeing villagers with ease. Unlike modern rifles or artillery, which functioned through distance, medieval weapons placed knights directly in the spaces of others. Breath, noise, and the shock of steel were unavoidable. That closeness amplified fear, and fear itself became part of the weapon. Soldiers today rely on systems of coordination, radio communication, and fire discipline, which makes them deadly in organized formations, but less likely to act as free agents of chaos. Knights, by contrast, embodied chaos in human form, a byproduct of a decentralized feudal system where every lord's retinue carried its own rules and ambitions. So when we say knights were more dangerous than modern soldiers, we're not claiming they could destroy more targets or fight more efficiently in today's sense. We're recognizing that the danger of a knight lay in his autonomy, his constant readiness for violence, and the absence of institutional restraints that modern militaries now impose. He was at once soldier enforcer, and predator, able to operate with immediate physical dominance in almost any close-range encounter. That's the foundation for understanding the true difference. Knights were shaped to be personally dangerous in ways modern soldiers are systematically prevented from being. Number 2. The Knight's build, gear, training, and the warhorse. A full set of plate armor reinforced with mail was not simply a heavy shell, but a carefully engineered system. The weight, often 20 to 30 kilograms, was distributed across the body with articulated joints, supported by a padded gambeson underneath. This design allowed surprisingly free movement. A trained knight could sprint short distances, climb, or wrestle without being disabled by his equipment. Armor did not make him sluggish. Instead, it gave him the confidence to push forward, since glancing sword cuts or arrows often bounced off. Combined with layered textiles, it absorbed shock and limited fatigue from repeated blows. In practice, the armor turned a knight into a mobile fortress, capable of surviving encounters that would kill a lightly protected opponent. Weapons were tailored to exploit and resist armor at the same time. A longsword, often lighter than modern myths suggest, could cut through unarmored opponents, but was equally useful for thrusting into gaps at joints or visors. Specialized techniques like half-swording and wrestling with the crossguard or pommel were taught for use against heavily armored foes. Maces, warhammers, and poleaxes served as concentrated impact weapons, transmitting force through steel plates to concuss or break bones. Each item in a knight's arsenal was designed for close, sustained combat. Unlike firearms, they needed no ammunition-only stamina, timing, and the courage to step into another person's space. Training built these abilities from childhood. Noble boys began as pages, learning etiquette, riding, and basic weapon handling. As squires, they shadowed knights, drilled in swordplay, lancework, grappling, and horsemanship. They practiced striking wooden targets with lances, wrestling in armor, and using terrain to their advantage. By adulthood, these routines created reflexive skill under stress. Tournaments reinforced this conditioning, providing semi-controlled environments to test strength, balance, and endurance in encounters that blurred sport and combat. Unlike modern military training programs that last months, a knight's preparation was a lifelong process that embedded war as a personal identity. The warhorse completed this system. Destriers, compact but muscular mounts, were bred for agility and aggression. Trained to remain calm under arrows, drums, and screams, they could drive straight into lines of infantry. Horses themselves acted as weapons, using their weight, hooves, and momentum to disrupt formations. With protective barding of steel or leather, they became harder to stop, and when combined with a couched lance and solid saddle support, the shock of impact could break enemy morale before weapons even crossed. This immediacy of force was unmatched. Where modern armies require tanks, air cover, or artillery to deliver such shock, a knight could unleash it on his own initiative. Taken together, the armored harness, versatile weapons, rigorous training, and warhorse created a fighter who dominated at close range. This combination made knights personally dangerous, not because they killed more than modern soldiers, but because their equipment and lifestyle gave them autonomy to decide when and how to escalate violence, turning them into individual engines of war rather than cogs in a larger, regulated system. Number 3. The fight itself. Close quarters brutality, chaos, and initiative. Medieval combat was defined by proximity, and that reality shaped how knights fought and why they were so dangerous. Unlike modern warfare, where rifles, drones, and long-range artillery dominate, the knight's battlefield was one where weapons only worked if you were close enough to hear your opponent breathe. That intimacy of violence meant every movement carried immediate consequences. A sword cut, a mace strike, or the thrust of a dagger was felt in the body of the person delivering it, and fighters adjusted in real time, responding to what they felt through the clash of steel. This feedback loop made knights adaptive. They practiced techniques that modern reenactments and surviving fight manuals still illustrate. Shifting grip on a sword to half-sword for precision thrusts, using polearms to hook shields or legs, or grappling in armor to finish an exhausted foe with a dagger through a visor. Armor added another layer of advantage, because combat wasn't just about landing a hit, but about who could stay effective longer. A well-trained knight knew how to conserve energy inside a helmet, how to pause and reset during lulls in the melee, and how to use armor as both defense and a tool for attack shield bashes, body checks, and trips turned the weight of metal into a weapon. As fatigue wore down less disciplined fighters, knights who managed their breathing and movements could press the advantage, striking decisively once opponents overextended or collapsed. This endurance in heavy gear was a skill cultivated from youth and crucial in prolonged clashes, where sheer stamina often separated survivors from casualties. Chaos was not an accident of medieval war, it was its natural state. Command structures were loose, and once battle was joined, centralized control often broke apart. A knight with a small group of retainers became a local decision-maker, pushing into weak points, exploiting terrain, or seizing prisoners for ransom. Initiative mattered more than rigid coordination. While modern units depend on communication systems to prevent friendly fire and synchronize action, knights thrived in the absence of such oversight. They acted quickly because there were no radios, no cameras, and no legal structures waiting to review their split-second choices. That freedom made their violence immediate and unpredictable. Outside the formal battlefield, the danger intensified. Skirmishes around supply trains, ambushes in forests, sudden night raids on camps, all demanded fighters who could improvise and dominate in close combat. Knights applied the same skills here, using rivers, ditches, and hedges as tools to trap and break enemies, much like modern soldiers use drones or sensors to gain an edge. Sieges, the most common form of medieval warfare, highlighted this brutality even more. Ladders going up walls, desperate struggles in breaches, and defenders meeting attackers at arm's length. In such tight spaces, discipline and training decided outcomes, and knights hardened by years of practice in armored grappling and shield work were at their most effective. The essence of the knight's danger came from this environment. The closer the fight, the fewer barriers existed between intent and action. Without modern systems designed to slow decisions or impose restraint, every choice a knight made had immediate impact. In that swirl of chaos, initiative and physical dominance made them exceptionally dangerous, not because they killed in greater numbers than modern soldiers, but because each encounter placed lethal power directly in their hands. Number 4. The wider ecosystem. Law, economy, and civilians in the crosshairs. Medieval knights operated inside a political landscape with thin state power and plenty of private muscle, so policy on the ground often arrived on horseback. Royal writs existed, but enforcement was patchy. Lords ran their own courts, collected dues, and maintained retinues that could switch from escort to enforcer without paperwork. That legal looseness mattered because it turned routine disputes over tolls, pasture, mills into armed problems. When negotiations stalled, mounted men imposed outcomes directly, and the social cost fell first on civilians. The economy rewarded that behavior. Warfare financed itself by seizure. Food from granaries, livestock on the hoof, coins from town gates, and, most profitably, human beings for ransom. A captured noble was a payday. A frightened market town was a revenue stream. A burned mill starved a district into concessions. The chevauchée, the classic mounted raid, made this logic explicit. Avoid set-piece battles, torch crops and barns, pull down bridges, and force the enemy lord to come to terms. Because that strategy targeted infrastructure people lived by, the battlefield was everywhere. Lanes, fields, ferries, and church greens. The chivalric code did not reliably protect commoners. Its strongest obligations were horizontal, aimed at peers. Spare a high-status captive. Honor a safe conduct. Keep terms once sworn. Villagers and traders were leverage, not protected categories, and there was no independent apparatus to record abuses or punish repeat offenders. Church movements like the Peace and Truce of God tried to curb violence on holy days or shield clerics and peasants, but compliance rose and fell with local politics. In sieges, the routine form of major warfare civilians were bargaining chips twice over. Outside the walls, foraging parties stripped the countryside. Inside, shortages multiplied as weeks dragged on. If a garrison refused honorable terms and a breach followed, custom often tolerated a sack. That wasn't random fury. It was a pay mechanism in an era of irregular wages. Knights led the storming parties and organized the division of goods and captives because disciplined plunder preserved unit cohesion and promised each retainer a share. Compare this with modern forces, which are built around procurement systems, audited supply chains, and legal oversight that tries, imperfectly, to separate military objectives from civilian life. Radios, cameras, after-action reviews, and external investigators insert friction between intent and harm. Medieval structures removed that friction. Even away from big campaigns, small wars never stopped. Private feuds, toll wars between towns and lords, armed debt collection by routiers or mercenary bands, and seasonal violence when unpaid troops lived off the land. City leagues and charters occasionally pushed back raising militias, building stone defenses, buying collective immunities, but those were local fixes, not a continent-wide safety net. The result was a security market dominated by men who could turn trained violence into rent. A modern soldier is a node in a bureaucracy that tries to channel force toward collective aims. A knight was often the bureaucracy. That concentration of legal discretion, cash incentives, and practiced coercion is why, in daily life, rather than in statistics of destruction, the individual knight represented a more immediate danger to ordinary people than today's soldier operating under institutional checks. Number 5. The limits, counters, and why dangerous still fits. Knights were never invincible, and medieval battlefields produced plenty of tools to check them. Dense infantry armed with long spears or pikes blunted shock charges by turning frontage into a forest of points. Flemish militias and later Swiss blocks showed that disciplined foot could halt armored horsemen without needing noble blood or lavish kit. Missile storms degraded elite cavalry before contact. Massed longbow or crossbow fire forced knights to dismount, bled formations, and made horses. The real engine of shock, the primary target. Terrain mattered just as much as weapons. Mud, ditches, hedges, stakes, and narrow lanes broke momentum and shredded cohesion. A heavy harness that was manageable on firm ground became a liability in churned fields or cramped breaches. Early gunpowder widened the gap. Handguns and bombards were crude at first, but each improvement ate into the value of plate and stone. Artillery made castle walls shorter-lived, forcing open field fights where combined foot and shot decided outcomes, and the cost and weight limits of armor left little room for escalation. Knights adapted more combat on foot, poleaxes and bills in tight ranks, reinforced helmets and gauntlets. But the trend line favored integrated forces over elite individuals. Logistics and physiology also set ceilings. Plate was well designed, yet sustained movement in armor handled heat poorly. Once riders and horses overheated, their tactical judgment and coordination dipped. Horses required fodder and rest that raiders could not always secure. And pay arrears encouraged units to scatter for foraging, which eroded mass and invited ambushes. None of that erases why more dangerous still describes the knight at the human scale. In micro-conflicts, the doorway fight during a stormed tower, the skirmish at a ford, the ambush on a road knights combined three elements modern soldiers rarely unite. Intimate weapons optimized for decisive use at arm's reach, social permission to act with minimal oversight, and a lifetime of training that normalized direct violence. Modern professionalism is more effective inside a system intelligence, radios, medevac, precision fires. But that same system inserts deliberate friction, identification drills, fire control procedures, collateral damage checks, and post-action scrutiny. Medieval structures stripped those breaks away. The economy rewarded ransom and coercion. The law bent around status and local power. The culture framed risk-taking as proof of worth. So, while pikes, mud, and powder ended the supremacy of heavy cavalry at the strategic level, the individual knight remained uniquely dangerous in face-to-face encounters, armored, confident, and able to escalate on his own authority in the places ordinary people actually lived and moved.